Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking to you today, the Guringai people, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My name's Kelly Mitchell from the Historical Services team at Stanton Library, and today I have the pleasure of introducing North Sydney Council's historian, Dr. Ian Hoskins, for the second in our online history talk series, Expressions of Faith, a historical look at North Sydney's Christian churches. We hope to continue this series, so please keep an eye on our website for further details. And if you have any questions during the talk, feel free to write them into the chat box and I will put them to Ian for a short Q&A session after his presentation. But for any other general inquiries, such as requests for digital images and so on, then please email us at localhistory@northsydney.nsw.gov.au and we will do our best to assist. Okay, so now I've just noticed a couple more people joining, so I will allow them into the room before I hand over to Ian. Okay.
Okay, should I kick off?
Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering if I'd been muted for a moment. Good. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming. And I hope you can see that screen and I hope you can hear me okay. I'm still getting used to just talking at a computer as if to myself, but I'll do the best I can. It's a little distracting at times. And I'm speaking to you on the land of the Camaragal people in North Sydney, which was given away from them without treaty or payment back in 1794. I think most of Kirribilli was given to a chap called Samuel Lightfoot, and thereby it entered the Sydney property market. Okay, expressions of faith. The idea for this exhibition, or this talk rather, it was an exhibition that we'd done back in 2008, which marked 150 years of the Catholic Church in North Sydney. So we had a few images from there and a bit of knowledge built up, but also an exhibition we mounted in 2011 when we commissioned a local photographer, Tony Perry, to go to as many churches in North Sydney as he could, inside and out, and photograph them. And we would add those photographs to the collection, and he did so. Tony was very interested in different photographic technology. So he produced digital images, but he also produced prints on fiber-based paper, which is pretty old school. So we've got this wonderful collection of photographs, and you'll see some of those and many others besides, a couple of the ones that I took in the process of researching things along the way. I don't know whether it's a disclaimer or what, but I used to be an altar boy, so I know a little bit about Catholic churches, but I'm now a very devout atheist, but still interested in church architecture and the meaning of all the bits of the elements of ecclesiastical architecture I find so interesting. And I especially find, I love churches because they've survived. I mean, not all of them, as you'll find out, but so many of them have survived from the 19th century when so much else from the 19th century has gone by the wayside, probably because they are buildings for a divine purpose. So they've been respected a little more than many other buildings. And they're sort of semi-public buildings too. So it's much easier to get into a church than it is a private house, of course. It used to be that you could walk into any church at any time, I think, but now most of them are locked up, except at service times, but it's possible to make appointments to check places out too. So I'd urge you to do that if you see anything of interest here. And to begin, it would be worth just acquainting you with the parts of a church, if you don't know those already. I hope you can see my cursor bouncing around. The nave is where the congregation sits. I mean, some churches have a tower in the middle or at one end, so that's variable. The chancel is also called the sacristy. Is also called the sanctuary in a Catholic church. The vestry is where the priest or the rector puts on his religious garb, and that's sometimes called a sacristy. Transepts are the cross elements of a church. Churches are sometimes laid out in a cross form, and the aisles generally separated by columns, as you'll see, particularly in the photographs of St. Thomas's when we get there. And sometimes there are chapels off to the side too, and some of the local churches have those. In Sydney, in the first 50 years of European settlement, there were few styles, but Georgian was one, and this St. James's Church is still with us in Phillip Street there, and that's a Georgian church. You can tell by the columns. There's columns there and the arches here. Not all churches with a spire are Gothic, in other words. You might have thought that was a Gothic church because it had a big pointy spire at one end, but in fact it's regarded as a Georgian church, designed by Francis Greenway, as you can see, and built in the early 1820s. And there were some classical churches, which is Georgian is a variation of classical too. And the only one surviving that I'm aware of is the Uniting Church in Pitt Street in the city. So it's really unusual in Australia to see a Georgian or a classical church. Far more common in America, where classical architecture was very popular. It expressed virtue, expressed a whole lot of things. Few of those early churches survive in Sydney at all. All of the churches that survive in North Sydney, and in fact most of those in Sydney from the 19th and early 20th century, and throughout the state, what used to be the colony, are Gothic churches of some form or other, mainly because of the influence of this chap here, Augustus Welby Pugin, who, as you probably are aware of, was the architect of the Houses of Parliament in London, built in the 1840s, but was in love with Gothic architecture, medieval architecture, and you can see that drawing there, which he designed for a church by A. Pugin, aged 9, for heaven's sake. And he and John Ruskin, they didn't like each other very much, as far as I can tell from what I've read, but both hugely responsible for the revival of Gothic architecture, love of medieval architecture in Britain, particularly in England, which overtook the Georgian architecture, which was, and the classically based Georgian architecture, which was popular during the reign of George's, first, second, third, and fourth. And that was the style of architecture that was prominent when Sydney was founded, when the colony of New South Wales was founded. So just as in Britain, there are waves of architectural fashion in New South Wales, and we get that Georgian style giving away to various Gothic styles of architecture through the 19th century. Gets a little complicated, and I won't get into too much detail, but it's Gothic that it becomes the dominant ecclesiastical style from the 1850s. And as I said earlier, that's the style that you're going to see in North Sydney. And this is one of the best examples that still stands. There's Edmund Blackett's. I've got 2 T's on there. That's a mistaken spelling. Sorry about that. There's only 1 T. Edmund Blackett and Son. He died in 1882 or 83, so it was just completed by his son. I think it was Cyril. And you've got a pinnacle there. That's the little spire. You've got the round window called a rose window. Beautiful stonework that might look like it's just built from chunks of stone, but it's all carefully cut. It's called rough ashlar. And when you look at it closely, you'll realize that the stone isn't laid in a uniform coursing, which is a layer. That's the term, coursing. It's a random coursing, so there'll be 2 stones and then 1 stone and then 2, and it's just a really, really beautiful church, inside as much as outside. And you can also see the slate tiles there with that line of what's called fish scale tiling all around. There are so many parts to be appreciated on the exterior as well as the interior of a Gothic church. It's there to delight and intrigue. as indeed as much of the English revival, of which this is a part of architecture in the 19th century. Georgian architecture derived from classicism was very much more staid, you know, unlikely to have lots of decorative elements on it, but every little nook and cranny on a Gothic building is going to have some decoration of some form or other, whether it's religious or secular. And there's a statue on the exterior of St. Francis Xavier Church, another beautiful church on the outside, at least, and unfortunately much changed on the inside. I might as well mention now that, again, as you may know, the Catholics loved human imagery, both in statuary and in coloured glass, in stained glass. Anglicans quite liked it, but you tend to see fewer statues in an Anglican church. You'll see images of people, you know, Jesus and the saints, less so Mary. Mary's a real champion in the Catholic Church, but you'll see images of people in windows. You'll see far fewer of that in the various Protestant denominations, Wesleyan, Methodist, or Baptist. They tend to be patterned windows, so they're into a direct conversation with God, if you like, and it doesn't need to be mediated by praying to a saint. That was regarded by those Protestant denominations as idolatry of one form or other. There was a lot of secular ill will in the 19th and 20th century, I can tell you, and it extended way into the 20th century, and that was my experience going to a Catholic church. We've been taught not to respect too much the Protestants at the bottom of the hill and vice versa. That's the inside of St. Francis Xavier. A little unfortunately, I think anyway, painted a uniform colour like that, but they're early windows at least. We've got Ignatius Loyola, who's a Jesuit icon. The churches in North Sydney, the Catholic churches, I think are all built by Jesuit priests, or for them. You've got Christ in the middle, and you've got St. Francis Xavier on the right there, and a really beautiful carved set of Stations of the Cross, which was once painted, not originally, but then someone thought it was a good idea. I think one of the priests there thought it was a good idea to paint it all up in lifelike colours, and someone else thought that was a bad idea, so they stripped it all back, but they did a fairly good job. I've looked at them a couple of times in there, and they are beautiful and very detailed. This is the sanctuary, so what is also called the chancel in an Anglican church, of the first stone St. Mary's. There were, and this is the third stone, this is the third St. Mary's. There was initially a tent in 1858, and then a little wooden church. And then in the 1860s, 63, I think, but we'll find out, is the first stone church designed by a chap called Munro. And that's called a reredos, that structure behind the altar. Typically before the 1960s, a priest would pray and do all the ritual bits with his back to the congregation, because it was all part of the mystery of the rites and all the rest. But you can see there are two paintings that were apparently provided by a member of the congregation, Mrs. Sahel. You've got 2 statues, and you've got Jesus on the cross. That's really typical of a Catholic church. You've got Mary there on the right, and Jesus on the cross. And I'm not quite sure who's there on the left, but that's whoever that is kitted up in the garb of an altar boy, and I was an altar boy for a while, and that's what I wore. The white thing's called a surplice. The robe underneath is a cassock. What a priest normally wears is a chasuble. It's a big sort of coloured overgarment, different colours for different parts of the year, depending on what festival is being celebrated. And here is really beautiful windows at Christchurch down at Lavender Bay. If you ever get a chance to go in there, either during a service or otherwise, look at these. 1880s, I was struck by how ripped Jesus was, if you'll excuse the expression, but I mean really very well built upper torso. And I thought that was quite unusual. So I've described these. I've I think they're sort of a pre-Raphaelite type design, you know, the bee-stung lips on all these characters. So that's Jesus rising from the dead. There was one angel when he arose, and there are the women, possibly Mary Magdalene there. So again, as I said earlier, Anglicans get into images of people in their windows, less so the statuary, but you're not going to find that so much in other denominations. But they're really worth looking. They're so beautiful. These are memorial windows. Typically, you will see on the windows, you know, who was being celebrated at the time, and I haven't actually recorded that, I'm afraid, on the caption, but I can certainly tell you later when I look more closely at it. And I think they went in the 1880s. It's rare to find a signature on a window, which is unfortunate, because then it's very hard to date unless they are a memorial window. Someone's died and a relative has paid for it and it goes in 1895 or whenever. A lot of them were imported from the UK, but some of them were made locally. Ferguson and Urey in Melbourne, Brooks Robertson in Melbourne. John Hardman was a very well-known British designer and maker of windows. There was Alfred Handel in Sydney and Frederick Ashwin in Sydney, and it would be great to know more about the windows in the churches. They are such astonishing works of art, and that's the Monte St. Angelo Chapel, as you can see, unusually featuring St. Gertrude, who the significance of whom I'm not entirely sure for Monte St. Angelo. They're Mercy sisters, but anyway, there she is, looking like a nun as she was, with the Holy Spirit. This is the Presbyterian church, which is still there up on Shirley Road and Nicholson Road. And it's an example of a simplified Gothic design, typical of the early 20th century, built in brick with some stone coursing and stone caps on those buttresses. There's a really marked shift in preference to the use of brick, which was cheaper. Really, it almost happens as the new century clicks over from the 19th to the 20th century. So if you see an all stone church, there's a good chance it was built in the 19th century. And if you see one that is predominantly brick, it's probably sometime in the first half of the 20th century, if it's Gothic anyway. So that was built around 1905. Jocelyn and Vernon, that's not Walter Liberty Vernon, I'm pretty sure, but another member of the family. But Howard Jocelyn worked with Walter Liberty Vernon on some of the large homes of Neutral Bay. This is the Baptist church, always was a Baptist church, built in 1911. It's really worth, when you go into a church, to make sure that you look up at the ceiling, because typically they are the most beautiful timber work you can imagine. And that's particularly the case with St. Thomas's. But this one has a pressed metal ceiling. Pressed metal was very popular in the early 20th century for houses and evidently, and for shops, and evidently here for this church. 1911 is the date I've got for that. I don't know whether it originally had pews. I imagine it did, but clearly they've just got those lines and lines of detachable chairs. And there's the window for that. So again, you're not going to see people there, typical of a Baptist church, but very, very beautiful nonetheless, with flowers and patterning. And here, one of my favorite churches are the windows at the Congregationalist Church in Alfred Street, now a Chinese Christian church, the second lease of life. And again, you can see flowers because it's a Congregationalist church, you're not going to see people. But these are commemorative windows. What's the date on those? 1897. Oddly enough, the Lead Thou Me On is the words of a John Henry Newman song or psalm. And he was a Catholic, so I'm not quite sure why that's in a Congregationalist church, but there we are. These actually were dedicated to a member of the choir, so perhaps they sang that hymn and they were particularly fond of it. Okay, so I'll work through, for the rest of the talk, I'll sort of work through chronologically from earliest to the later churches. We're going up to 1945. And again, they're all expressions of the Gothic. And there is the lone St. Leonard's Church. What was the first St. Thomas's Church, way up on the hill. This is a detail from a bigger map put together by Thomas Mitchell. And that road that you can see leading all the way up there is essentially Blues Point Road, going all the way up. That was the first gazetted government road through the Billy Blue estate. Billy died in 1834, and very soon after, in 1838, that road was gazetted, and his property was subdivided and sold off by members of the family, so it became publicly owned. Not publicly, the road was publicly owned, but many people living on what was once a single estate. And 1845 is the date of the first St. Thomas's Church, and there you can see a very early photograph of that, still with a bit of a forest behind, turpentine or whatever that is, and that style's Romanesque, so it's not a big high spire. Romanesque because of the squat roof on top of the tower there, and those arched windows on top of the tower. James Hume was the designer of that. Possibly James Hume also designed the pyramid in St. Thomas's Cemetery for Alexander Berry. That's a suggestion of a local historian, Cameron Sparks, did some research on that. And yeah, that very interesting too. The cemetery is detached from the church because Berry's wife died as they were building the church in 1845, and he needed somewhere close by to bury her. He didn't want to bury her in the public cemetery on the south side. And he gave I think 4.5 acres of land at the eastern end of his vast estate, the Wollstonecraft Berry estate, to the Anglican Church. He was already falling out with the Presbyterian Church. He was a Scotsman, but he swapped over to the Anglican side and lived just down the road from St. Thomas's. He probably pitched in a bit of money to build that too. Typically, churches were built through subscription. So if you've got a wealthy or large congregation, you're going to get essentially a fancier church. There's another image of that church which gives you a better idea of what it looked like and the people turning up to it. And I found in L.F. Mann's really wonderful article in 1932 about his memories of living in Neutral Bay in the 1860s, about what it was like to get to that church, which was the only Anglican church in the 1860s. And the Church of England was the society church, the establishment church, very much superior to the Roman Catholic Church. There was in fact, it was the only recognised church until the Church Act of 1836, and then the colonial authorities actually gave aid and gave land for other churches for other denominations to build churches. But everyone in those days would meet at the church. Old hands and young would come from a distance in sulkies or on horseback and leave the horses tied to the fence. Some would bring their dogs. There were no lights, and numerous lanterns flitting here and there marked the worshippers negotiating the goat tracks to their homes. You can imagine a lot of the north side is still heavily forested, and what that must have been like getting to and from the church. And if you're doing that from Neutral Bay, which is where the Manns lived, down just beside Hay Street, where the customs depot is today, they were taking advantage of high tide to get some of the distance in a boat. So a bit of an adventure getting to church, especially if you're dressed up as those people seem to be. How about that? There's the second St. Thomas's. So the congregation outgrew that early church within 40 years. How about that? And got enough money together to build a church designed by Edmund Blackett and Son. Now you might think, well, that doesn't look like the St. Thomas's that's there today, and that's because it was designed with a spire and there wasn't quite enough money to build the spire. So there's a drawing of what it was going to look like, and it's not uncommon to find that a church is built, but there wasn't not quite enough money to get over the line. That was the case with Christchurch down at Lavender Bay too. So there's the church that's realised, and you can tell if we go back and forth that the the squat tower, which almost looks like a Romanesque tower on the left, is where the spire would have gone, but they just had to build a corrugated iron roof over the top. I can't recall whether that's still corrugated iron or whether they've since put slate on there. But it's a really, really beautiful church. Lots of, Gothic detailing, the gargoyles. No saints, as far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, as St. Francis Xavier's has, St. Francis Xavier in one of the alcoves on the outside. We've got this real medieval look. And there it is inside. It's such a stunning building. Not quite sure why that sandstone is so white, but it is. It's so beautiful. And you can see the vaulted ceiling there. Better photograph of that. Just astonishing that congregations would pitch in and build and be able to afford structures like this. Just really amazing. Now, and it's important to remember also that these churches become over time war memorials, after the First World War. That's particularly the case with Anglican churches and Presbyterian churches, and less so with Roman Catholic churches. In fact, I can't think of a Roman Catholic church with a war memorial within it. And even though from the work I've done, 25% of the population of North Sydney was Roman Catholic, the volunteering in the First World War was about 20% of Catholics. So even though the Irish were not fond of the British, still a lot of them in the colonies joined up to fight that war. But for whatever reason, the churches didn't fill themselves up with memorials. But that is one of the most poignant ones at St. Thomas's. That's a cross that was retrieved from the battlefield at Pozieres in 1917. Just amazing. There's much else there besides to look at too, because that's the garrison church for the 17th Battalion. And that gives you an idea of where St. Thomas's was and is. This is an 1887 map, so the new church would have been there at that point, and how close it is to the first Roman Catholic church, 1858, not long after that, which, as I said, began as a tent and then a timber building. And then this one, William Munro, 1867. Sorry, I said 1863 earlier. So already the Catholic congregation, and North Sydney, or what was called St. Leonard's at the time, wasn't heavily populated, but they got enough money together to build that. And there's a quote, nothing daunted by the well-known poverty and paucity of the district. Father Kenny, has arranged that a new church recently commenced shall be 12 feet longer and 2 feet wider than originally planned. How about that? How they afforded it. Beautifully made, because you saw the interior of it earlier on in that photograph. There it is again. So that gives you an idea of the significance of the church for the community. They are really giving up hard-earned pounds to pay for this, and also to pay for their priests too, because the collection plate gets passed around every service. Now, believe it or not, so 1867, and already by 1896, they've torn down that church and built another one designed by William Wardell, no less, who lived locally, lived in Edward Street, and he's the architect of St. Mary's Cathedral. So how about that? There are no photographs that I know of the interior, but what an amazing thing to have a Wardell church. And the Catholic Church, as far as I can tell, don't put a lot of store in architectural heritage, because they were happy to pull down the Wardell Church in the 1930s and replace it with a much larger Romanesque church. And I sort of wince a bit every time I say that, as interesting though that church is. And that's the one that's there today, the current St. Mary's, and that's the interior. I do mourn the loss of a William Wardell, probably influenced by Pugin's design too, because he was a student of Pugin from afar. So that really is a loss. Now, and this is very typical of a 20th century church, because it's predominantly brick. This one's interesting because it's this pale brick, but there's use of sandstone too. And again, that's not unusual. You can see a very modern ceiling there. So not the vaulted ceiling. It's typical. This is described as Romanesque because it's very squat. It's more like a basilica, that huge, just rectangular space inside. Very much simpler. You can see a movement. You can see the effects of modernity, if you like, or modernism rather, on the design, because we're losing a lot of the detail from 19th century Gothic design. Okay, and the population of North Sydney, St Leonard's again at the time, skyrockets between the 1860s and 1890. In that time, it goes from about 1,000 to 17,000. So not surprisingly, there are quite a few churches built, and these are the ones that go up in the last decades of the 19th century. Some of them that's still there and some of them not. Let's start with St Peter's Presbyterian, which is there, and you can see in the foreground in its earlier iteration with a big tower and just a rectangular building behind. Just while we're looking at that photograph, on the left is the Methodist Church, the Wesleyan Church. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then down the hill on the far right, you can see Christ Church. Only would have just been completed there. And while we've got this photograph there, you can see side porticos, which may be chapels within the church. They're not entry points, but that's unusual to have three of those side porticos on each side. Christchurch was also supposed to be built with a spire, and they couldn't afford that. St Francis Xavier is just yet to be built, so it's up within the next 5 years. But anyway, let's focus on St Peter's in the foreground, and there's the footprint of St Peter's. The churches we just saw at the spire was there, so we're looking to the south here, and you've got the transepts are uneven, built at different times. I suppose explains that. Maybe also something to do with the nature of the block of land. And this is the nave, so this is where the people sit. So it's not unusual to have a church grow over time, but the Catholics chose just to demolish the previous churches and build afresh, for better or worse. There's one of Tony's photographs, and there's St Peter's as it appears today, and you can see the uneven transepts there. So let's move to St Francis Xavier, which is here, just called Catholic Church. And there it is there. Another William Wardell design, quite an unusual design, very asymmetrical. I don't find it all that attractive. There's St Peter's in the foreground, but really interesting nonetheless. Very unusual tower. There it is there, with a big modern box on the side. Sort of, I think a bit of an unsympathetic box went on in the 1960s. Here again is that rough ashlar stone in a random coursing. So it's not just one line of stone, it's sometimes you've got two, similar to the way that Barnett designed St Mary's, again with a big rose window. Now in that box that you saw on the left there, this is the stained glass window that was installed. Stephen Moore is one of the most famous of the modernist stained glass windows designers in Australia. And you can see, again, modernism means everything becomes stylized and a bit abstracted. So it's very different from a 19th or early 20th century window. And there are the modernist style pews too, which I think are used throughout the church. So late 1880s, sure, it's 1879, sorry, I think is the beginning of St Francis Xavier. And here's Christ Church, designed by Benjamin Backhouse. Again, you see those side porticos. There may be chapels within. Those windows I showed you earlier with the pre-Raphaelite Christ and Angel and the Mary Magdalene and others, these are they there. When I refer to a lancet window, it's this type of pointed window here, and you sometimes get them in up to groups of up to 7 or 8 in a bigger church. But it's a really, really beautiful church. I haven't quite worked out where the spire was supposed to go. There's a pinnacle. I'm not sure which end it was supposed to be. It's not obvious, whereas it is on St Thomas's. And just to orientate you, there's the water down there. That's Lavender Bay. There's another view of it. Not often open, but again, you can roll up during a service and appreciate the church being used. And so there's Christchurch, and here's the what's called here the Wesleyan Chapel, which is a Methodist church. It's a bit of a sad story. This one was designed by Thomas Rowe, who is a really prominent religious and secular architect. So this is built as early as 1864, and it's a substantial church. And again, you can see that rough ashlar stone, no photographs of the interior. And, it lasts, 1864, it lasts 70 years or so, and there it is being torn down because they need to widen the road for the approaches to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So that's the only example of a church being demolished for public works that I'm aware of, at least in North Sydney. And that's a bit sad. There's a plaque on the spot. It's just down near the intersection of the Pacific Highway with Blue Street today, if you're wanting to go and have a look at that. So that's up here. Junction Street was all of that. A road was pushed through there for the, and that was widened for the approaches to the Harbour Bridge. Let's go to the Congregational Church. I showed you some the stained glass windows there. There it is there. This is really one of my favourites and really unusual for the 19th century because it's a mix of brick and stone. Before I flick on this, look at all the elements to be appreciated, all the entrances, the porticos, and this wonderfully asymmetrical tower there. I assume it originally had a bell. This stood at the intersection of Alfred Street and Willoughby Street. Willoughby Street still exists on the eastern side of the bridge going down to Kirribilli, but it's blocked off because of the bridge. I meant to find a photograph, I couldn't find it in time, which shows you a view of this church from Careening Cove. You can see it all the way up. So it was really beautifully positioned to be viewed from many parts of St Leonard's. A really, really lovely church. I couldn't believe how cheap it was, £900 to £1,000. Now, a stonemason's wage at that time was about £3 a week. If you use that as the basis for a calculation in modern day costs, I may have miscalculated, but I did it a couple of times. And if you equate a stonemason's wage with a skilled tradesperson's wage today, that church cost about between 500,000 and $1 million, which seems remarkably cheap for all the work that was put into it. There it is there. And the reason I love it so much is the use of this really unusual red clay brick and that beautiful stone. Really unusual brick. See a lot of that in North America, but you don't see it in Sydney at all. So I'd love to know where those bricks came from. The Oaks Brickworks was up and going by 1880, but I just haven't seen any other building like that. So it's a real favourite of mine. Really well used by a Chinese Christian congregation. Regularly there, they have services in Mandarin and Cantonese. They were very kind to let me in one day when they saw me poking about to take the photographs of the windows that you saw earlier. So there it is there on Alfred Street. Let's move down to St John the Baptist Church, sometimes called the Church by the Bridge, designed by one of Blackett's sons, Arthur, just after Blackett died, in the early English style. So it's very simple, and it's built of brick, which is unusual too, with this Gothic timber bell tower. And there's a simple interior. Yes, that says ER because it's very near Admiralty House. So the Viceregal Residency, and I assume the Governor General comes up here for church when he needs to. I'm not sure whether the Queen has ever been in there. That looks like it's been all painted. I don't know. I assume it was originally painted and rendered. And the last of these ones is kind of the saddest too. Just down there, there's the footprint there from an 1890s map. And there it is there, the Star of the Sea Catholic Church. was originally built as a congregational church in 1863. That is straight out of Augustus Pugin's early English church sort of catalogue of designs. It wouldn't surprise me if he sent out plans for this upon request. And believe it or not, the Catholic Church bought it from the Congregationalists. It became part of St Aloysius, and then they knocked it down in the 70s to expand the playground. And you know, I wince a bit every time I say that too. That's a real loss. So let's move into the later 19th century and early and through the 20th century churches. And here's a list of the ones that I could find at any rate. So how many we've got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 churches built in that time. Beautiful windows still being made right into the 1940s. Still, you can see these a little bit transitional, a little bit stylized, but still very much more similar to a 19th century window than Stephen Moore's window that you saw at St Francis Xavier, made only less than 2 decades later in the early 1960s. So let's, there's St Augustine's in Shell Cove Road. Another Jocelyn design, Jocelyn Gilling this time, on the site of an earlier church, a smaller church that was built in the 1880s. Here's one of Tony's photographs. And there's the interior, lots of brick, which again is typical of a 20th century church with the use of the stone there. Beautiful organ, not unusual to have an organ with a side set of pipes there. So you're going to get a really lovely sound out of that. Probably the original pews. And the thing I love most about this church are the windows, particularly that one. There's Trooper Jones being welcomed into heaven, and his mother paid for that window. Goodness knows how much a window like that would have cost. 1925, that would have been installed when the church was built, and he died in 1919, presumably of disease or wounds or something, because the war was over by then, the fighting over. I've got killed, but I think he died, unless he was killed in an accident. I need to revisit that, but he was a light horse trooper. So really stunning. So if you can get a chance to roll up to St Augustine's before, that's worth having a look at. Here's the Neutral Bay Presbyterian Church. So you've got another congregation spreading up to Neutral Bay from Blues Point Road, which is the site of the original church there. And this is a fascinating photograph because there's a brick church with a timber front. And I was looking at this thinking, oh, that's an unusual looking church, and particularly unusual because it's got an architect. It's not just thrown up by a builder. Charles Slater, I think is, yeah, there we are. Charles Slater was the architect of that. And I was pondering why it would have a timber front, and that's brick with stone. So there's an early use of brick and stone. I said it was really a feature of the 20th century, but there's proved me wrong. And there it is, as it was properly finished in 1908. So there's a portico in the front. So clearly Slater had intended that, and maybe there wasn't quite enough money to finish off the front of it, but that's how it looked from 1908 and how it looks today, because there's another of Tony's wonderful photographs. Not quite sure how he got that darkened effect, but you really get a sense of the church from that. Now this has a very special organ in it, built by Charles Richardson, 1912, and restored, so worth going to hear that. I think the whole interior of the church has been restored by the look of it, but it's in fine shape. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. How about that? And this is the last church I'll talk about today, to leave us some time to answer some questions. This is St Joseph's Catholic Church in Lindsay Street, Neutral Bay. And you can see the Gothic, well, actually, here we are, sorry. This is another example of Romanesque, but I'm going to get onto Gothic in a sec. So this is designed by one of the partners in the architectural firm that designed the last and the present day St Mary's. And you can see this is in the Romanesque style here because you've got these two vaulted fronts. So it's a stylized version of the St Mary's Church, all done in a light brick here. So not Gothic, but so I've described it as stripped Romanesque there. Lots of hard edges, whereas St Mary's has those beautiful curved barrel vaults at the front. But it's hard not to think that Fowle was not influenced by that church there by Giles Gilbert Scott, which is Gothic. Both of them are evidence of the influence of modernism, because everything is becoming stylized and simplified. So there is a modernist Gothic church in Luton, England, not in Australia, 1927, and there's that one. I've no idea whether Joseph Fowle looked at that, but it'd be hard to think that he wasn't aware of it because there are so many similar elements, not least these vents and things at the top. So I'll leave it at that. You know, and there's time there for some questions. We've got at least 5 or 6 minutes for questions before the end of the hour. And I'd really encourage you, as I've got written there, to go along to churches, you know, regardless of what your faith might be, because they are so beautiful, the ones that survive in North Sydney, and the stonework, the glasswork, the woodwork is just astonishing. And to go and see them being used at the time of a service is even better, because, you know, it's always best to appreciate a church as it's functioning. And you might be lucky to hear an organ firing up with all the pipes there. I'm not so fond of modern religious music with electric guitars and drums, so you might have to ring up to see when there's going to be an organ recital, but it's certainly worth going to hear that. And thank you, and I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions, so you can read out some questions if you're still there, Kelly.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'm sure everyone would like to join me in thanking you for taking us on that wonderful tour through the history and beauty of North Sydney's churches. As you say, we're very lucky to have so much to enjoy